There is no one better than Western leaders who can reveal the dirty plans of their own countries. Throughout history, the West has been linked to acts of cruelty and abuse, especially in Africa, where these behaviors hit new heights. The West's self-interest cost millions of people a lot, and it led to levels of manipulation in finance, wars, and conflicts that had never been seen before. Even so, it was never fully revealed how much money Western countries made from these actions. Things were kept secret, and the public only knew what got out. In this case, Hillary Clinton's email about taking cash and killing Muammar Gaddafi got out. But recently, a leader from the West showed what the West has been doing in Africa for decades. Claire Daly, an Irish politician and member of the European Parliament, took the West's clothes off and showed it to the world. She said that the West has been paying for wars and battles in Africa to make the continent look like it needs help from the West. What did she state? How did her speech show that the West is bad? In this video, let's talk about that. You need to first understand something. Western countries start fights and wars in African countries so they can take advantage of them. It's a reminder of how Western countries used Africa's resources and people for their own economic gain during slavery. By starting wars and other problems in Africa, the West makes it easier for Western countries to take advantage of Africa's many natural resources. During battles, there is a lot of chaos and weaker government, which makes it easier to get resources without facing strong pushback. The idea of divide and rule is at the heart of this argument. It says that Western countries take advantage of the differences between African countries by backing different clans or groups to stay in power and stop the formation of unified nations that could stand up to outside pressure. What's more, Western military interventions, masked as peacekeeping or humanitarian assistance, cloak hidden motives. Establishing military bases is a strategic move to secure long-term influence and control, furthering both strategic and economic interests. On top of that, the provision of aid and assistance functions as a double-edged sword. While aid ostensibly targets development and humanitarian needs, it creates economic dependencies that can be manipulated to the advantage of Western nations. Since Western countries want to stay in charge, the fact that Africa is easily attacked during wars helps them. That's what Claire Daly said, but she said a lot more than everyone else did. While she was in the European Parliament, Claire Daly began to reveal one by one the Western plans for Africa. She started by talking about the war going on inside Sudan, where two army generals were vying for power and control of the country. She said that the Western media tells a story about two tyrants, two competing armed groups, and regular people who are scared and running away. But it doesn't explain anything, gives no background, and doesn't say who is responsible. It hides the fact that this is because of decades of colonial abuse and abuse that is still felt in Sudan and Africa as a whole. She said that the wealthy people in Europe felt powerless and were thinking of ways they could help the Africans out of their situation. Notably missing from the talk are any references to European funding, external border policies, or the funding of state troops that work to stop desperate people from going north to Europe. It was discovered that the Western role in this disaster is often carefully left out, giving the impression that it came from nowhere. Even though everyone agrees that peace is needed, the focus is still on what needs to stop instead of what needs to be done. She meant that the West should stop getting involved in and funding wars in Africa and do something else instead. Daly said that Sudan needs a democratic government, fair economic conditions, and an end to Western-funded insurgent groups using violence to take money from rural areas. She thought that meddling from the West was the main reason why Sudan had been unstable and painful for decades. The point is easy to understand. The people of Sudan might be able to get a regular government if the West stops giving the warlord any money. You should know that Daly has been calling out Western arrogance for years. She meets opposition because she is one of the few who says the truth, especially from other European Parliament members who don't seem to see things her way. Still, she keeps showing how hypocritical they are. There are unfair rules and questionable actions. Daly said that the word state sponsor of terrorism comes from US law and is not recognized by EU law. However, an expert in Parliament magazine says that it should be used. This type of reporting, while sensational, actually makes achieving peace more difficult, playing right into the hands of extremists who thrive on perpetual conflict. It appears to be a deliberate attempt to hinder any potential detours or efforts to build bridges. That's when she talked about the West's state-sponsored terrorism. She said that if we are going to talk about designating state sponsors of terrorism, let's not overlook European support for Israeli terrorism in Palestine or Western backing of Saudi terror in Yemen. Western countries, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, have faced criticism for providing military support and selling arms to Saudi Arabia, a key player in the coalition engaged in military operations against Houthi rebels in Yemen. Such Western support exacerbates the conflict's intensity and prolongation. You should know that the conflict in Yemen has resulted in a severe humanitarian crisis, marked by widespread civilian casualties, displacement, and food insecurity. Concerns have been raised about the impact of Western support for Saudi military operations on civilians and the worsening of the humanitarian situation. Some argue that Western nations should reconsider their backing in light of these humanitarian concerns. She further said that the roots of ISIS can be traced back to the sponsorship of France, the US, Britain, Turkey, and the Gulf in Syria and Iraq. The US's historical endorsement of terrorism against the Cuban Revolution, Nicaragua, squads in Guatemala, and El Salvador, and the tragic events in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia sharply contrast with the accusations being thrown around. The main argument here is that the European Union seems selectively ignorant and indifferent, particularly in conflicts involving African countries. Despite their supposed detachment, they have contributed to wars and conflicts, supporting various agendas and rebel groups. We saw this in 1994 when the French involved itself in the Rwandan genocide. The genocide, characterized by the mass slaughter of the Tutsi ethnic group by the Hutu majority, unfolded in a matter of months, resulting in the deaths of approximately 800,000 people. The role of France in the events leading up to and during the genocide remains a subject of scrutiny and debate. In the years preceding the genocide, Rwanda was marked by long-standing ethnic tensions between the majority Hutu and minority Tutsi populations. The assassination of Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana in April 1994 served as a catalyst, triggering a wave of violence that spiraled into one of the most brutal genocides in modern history. France had historical ties with Rwanda, dating back to the colonial era. During the 1990s, France maintained close diplomatic, military, and economic relations with the Hutu-led government in Rwanda. The Habyarimana government was seen as a friend by French leaders in the area, and they offered political and military support. As the genocide happened, France started Operation Turquoise, a military operation that was supposed to create a safe zone for people who had to leave their homes. Reports, on the other hand, show that this action wasn't just about helping people. It was also about geopolitical interests and keeping power in the area. Also, France could have stopped the slaughter, but it did nothing to stop it. People have said bad things about France's backing of the Hutu-led government before and during the genocide. There are concerns about the French government's involvement because it has a history of supporting the Habyarimana rule and doesn't seem willing to recognize early signs of impending violence. There are claims that France gave weapons and military training to the Hutu-led government, which made the killing machines used in the slaughter more powerful. People have said that France was involved in the killing because it was thought to be supporting the Hutu government. Some say that French troops during Operation Turquoise worked with the genocide culprits by giving them a safe place to stay and letting important people get away from punishment. Following that, the Blood Diamonds event in Sierra Leone from 1999 to 2002 made the world very aware of how the diamond trade became linked to conflict, funding for war, and the participation of outsiders, especially from the West. During that time, Sierra Leone was going through a very bad civil war. Different rebel groups were fighting for power and using the country's many diamond mines to fund their activities. These gems, which are called blood gems or war diamonds, were mined in horrible conditions, and the money made from them fed the war. The desire for gems in the West was a big part of how this war was paid for. Rebel groups, especially the Revolutionary United Front, took over diamond mines and used the money they made to buy weapons and pay for their operations. The illegal gem trade became a major way for these groups to make money, which allowed them to keep up their violent actions. Western countries intentionally made this problem worse by taking part in the world diamond market. Diamonds were in high demand, especially in Western countries. This created a profitable market that made the fighting in Sierra Leone worse. Because there weren't strict checks and balances in the diamond supply chain, these conflict diamonds were able to get into the market with real ones. The rebels used diamonds to buy weapons from the West. Instead of rejecting the purchase of diamonds and the sale of weapons, Western countries decided not to miss the profit, a profitable venture. Then there was the problem in Libya, which showed that wars and battles in Africa were good for the West. The West made it a habit to keep Africa from having peace because they knew that wars made more money. The problem got worse when Muammar Gaddafi was removed from power in 2011. This created a power vacuum that different groups and gangs tried to fill. Because NATO helped kill Muammar Gaddafi, it shows that the West started and spread the war. The West, especially NATO countries, was very important in the action against Gaddafi, but it was hard to get the area back to normal afterward. The funding of war and disputes in Libya has changed the direction of events, whether it was direct or indirect. Different groups have been able to stay alive thanks to resources like money and weapons. This has made the crisis last longer. As important members of the international community, Western countries are being closely watched for their parts in the operation and the efforts that followed to make the area more stable. Besides that, the West is sending weapons to African war zones to make sure that terrorists and terrorism will always be a problem there. This has led to long discussions that have raised moral, political, and social issues. Arms sales are an important part of the economies and strategies of Western countries like the US, Russia, the UK, and France. Arms sales make up a big part of these countries' GDPs, so the military business is very important to their economies. Arms sales are driven by the desire to make money, as defense companies actively look for markets for their goods. Unfortunately, war zones often turn into profitable markets that draw both fighting groups and states that want to improve their military. Arms smuggling into conflict zones in Africa has effects that go beyond economics and have a big negative effect on the security of the area. Giving guns to people involved in a conflict can make it more violent, prolong fighting, make the conflict worse, cause more deaths, and force civilians to leave their homes. Sales of weapons to areas of war also cause serious humanitarian problems because they can lead to violations of human rights like killing bystanders, forcing people to leave their homes, and other horrible crimes. Arms being easy to get can have long-lasting effects on communities, making it harder to heal from war. Also, selling weapons to different sides of a conflict can lead to proxy wars, in which outside forces back opposite groups. This makes the fight more complicated and global, which makes it harder to solve. You should know that there are no factories of Western arms companies in Africa, but the rebels still get weapons that are made in the US and other Western countries. This raises the further question of whether the weapons are smuggled into Africa. The arms trade operates without comprehensive international regulations, allowing weak enforcement of existing agreements and facilitating arms, reaching unintended destinations, or being used against the principles of responsible arms transfers. Even during the Cold War, Africa was not left alone and was used as a ground for proxy wars and conflicts. Newly independent nations such as Angola, Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of Congo became battlegrounds for brutal proxy conflicts involving the United States, the apartheid-era South Africa, and China, all seeking to stem the spread of communism in the global South. Simultaneously, Cuba and the Eastern Bloc supported these nations. The Soviet Union's engagement in Marxist African struggles began in 1960, providing political support, weapons, and military training, notably to the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola in their struggle against the Portuguese. However, Soviet assistance alone proved insufficient, as evident in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1975, following the awkward Portuguese departure from Angola, the MPLA faced opposition from rival movements funded by the CIA, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the South African apartheid regime. None welcomed the prospect of an African Marxist party assuming power in resource-rich Angola. Recognizing the U.S.'s war-fatigued stance after the Vietnam War, Fidel Castro initiated Operation Carlotta in 1975 to support the MPLA, reshaping the historical trajectory of Southern Africa. Fidel Castro emphasized the profound ties of blood and history between Cuba and Angola, highlighting that a significant number of enslaved Africans brought to the island to work on plantations were from Angola. He stressed the sense of duty felt by Cubans to repay this historical debt. Although Cuba had provided limited support to the MPLA since 1965, especially during Che Guevara's time in the Congo, the dynamics significantly shifted from 1975 onward. Gabriel Garcia Marquez later commented on Che Guevara's impactful journey through Africa, stating in that brief, anonymous passage through Africa, Che Guevara was to plant a seed that no one would destroy. From the 1960s, cinema was pivotal in the alliances between Cuba, the USSR, and African liberation movements. Filmmaking, both documentary and fiction, emerged as a vital aspect of global rebellious causes, attracting young members of guerrilla movements like the Pequist Flora from Ghana, Nana Hata, to Cuba to learn the language and techniques of third cinema. This movie movement represented the early idealistic ideas of Africans fighting against colonialism. As support for African groups grew around the world, producers were sent to help them make movies and teach others how to make movies. The Soviet Union also did a lot to help African cinema grow. In Moscow, famous directors like Osman Assemblée, Soleil Manasisa, and Abdurrahman Asisoko learned their craft. During the fights for freedom, movies were used to both record current battles and spread propaganda. They were also used to help people feel like they had a post-colonial national identity. However, the time when these things were popular in Africa was short. At first, Cold War forces helped feed the internal conflicts in Mozambique, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now these conflicts were growing on their own. Edward George says that there were at least 36 foreign countries that played a major role in Angola's civil war, which lasted until 2002. A very important part of this history that is often forgotten is the part that Cuba played in ending apartheid in South Africa by getting involved in Angola. At the Battle of Cuito Cuanavalo in 1988, the MPLA probably would not have won against UNITA and the South African Defense Force without help from the Soviet Union and Cuba, which sent weapons and 50,000 Cuban men. In the years after World War II, the ideological clash between communism and democracy made things difficult between the USSR and the US, which led to the Cold War. As a result of the fast spread of nuclear weapons in the late 1950s and early 1960s, this stress almost turned into full-scale war more than once. By supporting leaders who were friendly, both countries tried to grow their influence, especially in the Third World. The idea is that friendly states could be allies in regular wars or places to store nuclear weapons in case of nuclear war. Both diplomatically and physically, the US and the USSR tried to set up places where they could attack each other. Africa, especially its southern and central parts, became a good place for these kinds of operations to happen. As a result of the end of World War II, colonial powers such as England, Portugal, Germany, and Belgium lost power, leaving countries to seek freedom. As a result, the US, the Soviet Union, and China tried to fill these gaps with money and weapons, which led to fights and eventually full-scale wars. It was disruptive for years and led to more wars, genocide, and bad feelings in the neighborhood because of these proxy wars. The Republic of the Congo Leopoldville, emerging from Belgian rule, faced challenges after declaring independence in 1960. People like Mobutu Sese Seko, Joseph Kasavubu, and Patrice Lumumba were part in the power battle. Lumumba was the first prime minister. He was pro-nationalist and pro-communist, which caused Katanga to break away from the rest of the country. The US and the Soviet Union were interested because they wanted to control the rich uranium mines in southern Congo. Lumumba turned down Western help and went to work for the Soviets, which made people in the US afraid of Congo becoming communist and giving Moscow important uranium. Mobutu ousted Lumumba in a coup with help from US military aides. Lumumba was then put to death. The Congo crisis shows how both of Africa's giants handle foreign policy. They back governments with aid, weapons, and advisors instead of going to war directly. There were more than just physical resources at stake in these wars and later proxy wars. Political theory, economics, and regional strategy were also at play. The Congo issue shaped US and Soviet foreign policy in Africa for the next 30 years. It also showed how both countries indirectly backed the governments they wanted to see in power. The two countries had a lot of power over the politics of Africa during this time, but they avoided going to war with each other. This practice of funding wars and using African countries as fronts for other wars is still going on today. Right now, there isn't a superpower that can compete with the US. However, the West uses wars in Africa to avoid pushback and draw attention away from itself. By giving money and guns to conflicting groups inside African countries so they can fight, the West takes advantage of Africa's resources without any problems. At this very time, the West is trying to start a big war in Africa so that they can step in. Isn't it true that the West is to blame for the problems in Africa? Are you on board with the theory that the West pays for all the wars, battles, and coups in Africa so that they can spread to other parts of the world? Tell us what you think will stop the West from going into Africa this time if people know about this. Would you like to see more videos like this? If so, click the bell icon next to our station to join. We've chosen to show movies about Black culture, civilization, history, and proof of how great Black people have been, which is something that no one talks about. Cheers, and until the next movie, stay tuned.